Okay, the next one, atheism. The most ridiculous ism. To be honest, this has nothing to do with philosophy, nothing to do with science, nothing to do with thinking. It's to do with psychology. Honestly, I really believe this. And many atheists, they couch their discourse in intellectual language just to cover what is in their hearts, because I don't think it's an intellectual position. But in saying that, let's go to the Quran and find out how the Quran deals with atheism. Interestingly, the Quran hardly talks about atheism because in a way it assumes it's a spiritual psychological phenomenon. But there is one or two particular verses. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Quran 52, chapter 35 to 36, or were they created by nothing, referring to the human being, or were they the creators of themselves, or did they create the heavens and the earth, the universe? بَلْ لَا يُقِنُونَ. Indeed, they have no firm belief. Now this refers to the human being, but the ulama derive logical explanations for things that begin to exist, because it assumes things are khuliqu, meaning they were created, they are muhdath, they came into being. So anything that came into being, that began, you can use this Quranic logic. What's the Quranic logic? Number one, things that began to exist, they either were created by nothing, created themselves, created by something else created, or created by something uncreated. So let's work with this logic. If the universe began, could it be created by nothing? Why? Because from nothing, nothing comes. If I have some nothing, and I add a little bit more nothing, and I add a little bit more nothing, and I sprinkle some nothing, and I do something else to the nothing, all I'm going to get is exactly as in Urdu you say, kuch nahi. And I heard there's a saying called much nahi the kuch nahi, right? If you have a mustache, you have nothing. Crazy stuff, man. Anyway, so moving along. So from nothing, nothing comes. Now some atheists say, hold on one second, you have a quantum vacuum and that's nothing, and you have particles emerging from this quantum vacuum. Now what's a quantum vacuum? Let me make it simple for you. Imagine you had a huge cosmic hoover and you sucked all the particles away from the universe. What's left is a quantum vacuum. Now the quantum vacuum is not nothing. It's actually something. If you read a basic textbook on science, it's a sea of fluctuating energy. It's a rich structure. It obeys the laws of the universe. So they're wrong. It is not nothing. So something doesn't come from nothing. So the next point, could the universe create itself? Well, this is flawed. And let me give you a very crude example. Could your mother give birth to herself? That's a messy example, isn't it? Yeah? But the point is, this is wrong, right? Because self-creation implies that something existed and did not exist at the same time, which is a philosophical, logical contradiction. So the third point, could the universe be created by something else created ultimately? Well, intuitively, someone may say, well, maybe this universe was created by another universe. But there's a problem here. Let's carry on the question. If this universe was as a result of something else created like another universe, and that is created, and therefore it requires another universe. And that universe was created by another universe, and that universe was created by another universe, and that universe was created by another universe. If that goes on forever, will we ever have this universe? No. So it shows that there must have been something that's uncreated that brought the whole of creation into being. Let me make this a little bit more simpler for you. Imagine I'm an American Marine and I'm going to shoot a bird. If only they shot birds, right? So, may Allah guide us all. So, if I'm going to shoot a bird, right? In order for me to shoot, I have to ask permission from the Marine behind me. If he has to ask permission and that goes on forever, am I ever going to shoot the bird? Exactly. Similarly, ultimately, the universe must have been created by something uncreated, which makes sense of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Atheism has nothing to do with philosophy, with science, and with reason. I repeat, atheism has nothing to do with philosophy, with science, or with reason. Atheism is about psychology. Atheism is about emotions. Atheism is about spirituality. We have to understand that the concept of God is a necessary concept, as we believe in our tradition in the concept of the fitrah. We know the fitrah comes from the root that shares the same root with words such as fatrun and fatarahu, that Allah has created something within us to acknowledge Him and to worship Him. So the idea of the belief in God is a natural belief, to the point that the question shouldn't be why God, but the question should be, what reasons do you have to reject God? Because it's part of our own nature. As we see in the hadith in Sahih Muslim, where the Prophet ﷺ said, every child is born in this state, in this natural state. But it is society, his parents and his upbringing that deviate him away from this natural state. And this natural state, brothers and sisters, is confirmed by reality itself. For example, if we look into the works of sociologists, like the evolutionist sociologist Professor Justin Barrett, he did a study on children, and he came to the conclusion that even if you have atheist children and you put them on a desert island, they're going to believe in God. Also, if you look into, for example, key works in psychology, you have the psychologist who studies religion. Her name is Olivera Petrovich. She has a journal and she discusses that the natural psychological state of the human being is to actually acknowledge God. And actually atheism has to be forced on the psyche, on the soul, on the mind of a human being. So from this perspective, we have reality in line with what the Prophet ﷺ told us many, many years ago, that the concept of God is a natural concept. So the first type of doubt is what I call the intellectual type of doubt, okay? Now usually this comes from the scientific community, right? Or people who like science, because we live in an age of scientific rationalism. By the way, Islam loves science. According to Western historians, Ibn al-Haytham, the first scientist, was a Muslim. His name was Ibn al-Haytham. If you read the biographical works of Ibn al-Haytham, he had a big beard, mashallah, tabarakallah, and he prayed, and he was a pious man. And he said, I only do the science because I want to find out the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the creative world. So, with nothing to be ashamed of. But science has become like almost this social phenomenon now, that it's become a yardstick for everything. It could get you married, pay your taxes, brush your teeth, right? It's become like the religion of the white coats from a social perspective because it works, right? Now obviously the scientific academic community, they know just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. And they know that science doesn't lead to certainty. They know this because it's ever changing and shifting. It's the shifting sands of science. For example, read any book on the philosophy of science by Hugh Gauch, for example, right? Hugh Gauch, or even Alex Rosenberg, or Stathis Psilos, all the philosophers, Elliot Sober. These are all mainstream philosophers of science that you read on a postgrad and undergrad level, and they say, there's no certainty here. If you want certainty, go somewhere else. It's not in a science. Science is great, it works, it's beautiful, we love it, right? That's the nature of science, it's a useful tool. But what happens these days is, just because we hear sometimes a scientific conclusion, we go crazy. The amount of emails I get from Muslims, oh brother, they found the God particle, my iman is low. And I'm like, oh my God, what is this guy talking about? There's a popular magazine, yeah? God particle found, right? It's called the Higgs boson, right? And therefore, it shattered his iman. He wasn't bothered to read the scientific paper. He read it in a newspaper or in a popular magazine. He has no idea what the Higgs boson is. Just because someone said, a scientist said they found the God particle, therefore his iman is low. This is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. And it shows that we've suspended our level of thinking. Do you know what the Higgs boson was? The Higgs boson was a particle, right, that they found, that made up the Higgs field. The Higgs field was switched on in the early universe to give particles mass apart from the photon. That's what it was. Someone, right, according to them, switched on the Higgs field, and it gave particles mass apart from the photon. And what they found was the particle that made up the Higgs field. That's it. Doesn't deny God, doesn't affirm, got nothing to do with theology or creation, right? Nothing. And the reason they call it the God particle is because historically, it was so hard to find, they called it the goddamn particle. And because they were lazy, then they called it the God particle. And that's the point. It had nothing to do with theology. So, the reason I'm mentioning this, I know it's a crude example, but to show that science will never ever deny Allah. Ever. It can't. If you study the philosophy of science, it has no job. Because science, according to Professor Elliot Sober, restricts its attention to that which observations can solve. By the very definition of Allah, He's a metaphysical concept. Right? Meaning, He's not empirical. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. Allah is inside or outside the universe? Outside of the universe. If I make the table, I don't become the table, right? If I'm a carpenter, I make the table, do I become the table? I am distinct and disjoined from the table. As Ibn Taymiyyah said, that creation is distinct and disjoined from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. Al-Ghazali said the same thing. All of our ulama said the same thing. The mainstream ulama. So, science can never affirm directly or deny directly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because it can only address that which observations can solve. For it now to start discussing the existence of Allah, it's outside of its methodology. It's like having two rooms. I know what's in this room, but I don't know what's in the next room. And just because I see a carpet in this room, I cannot conclude logically, therefore, there is no carpet in the other room. So if you claim to be a scientist and you claim to deny God based on science, it's equivalent of having two rooms, you don't know what's in the other room, you're in one room, and just because you can see a carpet in this room, you now conclude there's no carpet in the next room. This is a logical fallacy. There is no logical leap. It doesn't follow. It's non sequitur, meaning it doesn't logically follow. And this is why I think it was Hugh Gauch, he says, to basically suggest that science supports atheism, you get high marks for enthusiasm, low marks for logic. Right? And any sincere academic scientist, go to Qatar Foundation, go to Education City, go to Oxford, go to Cambridge, ask a sincere scientist and a philosopher of science, and ask them, can science ever directly deny God? No, it can't. Because it's a metaphysical concept. Nothing which you observe can deny Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, what science can do is a few things. Number one, stay silent on the topic. Or number two, maybe suggest evidence that you can use to infer that there's a designer. But it can't directly deny Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anyone who knows their science, anyone who knows the philosophy of science can never deny God, no matter what they say. You had some guy, I think his name Victor Stenger, I think that's his name. He wrote a book, God the Failed Hypothesis, how science disproves God or something. It's a ridiculous book. Science can never deny God. All it can do is maybe suggest alternative models to explain how creation developed. But that's a different story, right? That's denying a creation story. That's denying how species were evolved, or they're affirming a different kind of narrative or different theory for how species evolved. That's a different discussion. But to outright deny a creator for the universe, this is impossible. Science can't deal with that at all.
لن نحيد عن خطى الإيمان دربنا درب قويم دربنا درب قويم بالهدى القرآني أبدا لن نحيد أبدا لن نحيد